Dave Talks Comics, Episode 96, Empire, Volume 1. Welcome to Dave Talks Comics, a program about comic books and cartoons. I talk about comic books I have read and cartoons I have watched. I summarize the stories. My summaries usually include spoilers, and personalize my presentation with my own opinions and insights. On this episode, I will be talking about Volume 1, the first 8 chapters of Empire. I should say that there's nothing adult about this presentation, but the comic book itself is probably better. I would say it's probably mature audiences, or at the very least, a PG-13. There are some disturbing things in this comic book. Many of which I will touch on in the process of talking about it. Empire is written by Mark Waid. The art is by Barry Kitson and James Pascoe. The first 2 chapters don't have titles, so the first chapter introduces basically the situation, introduces us to the main characters. The central character's name is Golgoth, and his ministers, or some of his ministers, get introduced in this chapter, and they are Tumbril, who's the Minister of Discipline, Lucullan, who's the Minister of War, Khafra, who's the Minister of Information, Zana, who's the Minister of Execution, and Cerberus, who I'm not sure exactly, I don't think they mention exactly what he is, but I'm thinking maybe he's the Minister of Espionage, and that'll become there's a reason why I think that. Part of it is because a lot of this chapter revolves around him conducting an investigation into a plot to kill Golgoth. And he's running around, he's interviewing all these people, and that's basically how these characters get introduced, is they're answering questions from him, and you don't even see Cerberus at first. You just see the various ministers responding to questions from him. The other character that gets introduced in this chapter is Delphi. Delphi is Golgoth's daughter. Now, she is very innocent. The other characters are not. They all basically have blood on their hands. The main character, Golgoth, has the basically backdrop of the story is that he's conquered most of Earth. He's a bad guy. He's conquered most of Earth, and there's only a few countries that remain to be taken. And that's basically where the story begins. And so the first chapter, like I said, it revolves around this investigation to find somebody who's plotting something against Golgoth. And once you've read this, or if you've read this, you'll know that he's a pretty impressive figure. He would be pretty tough to kill. And I'll get a little bit into that after I've talked about chapter 2. But basically, Cerberus ends up pissing off Golgoth, and it doesn't end well for Cerberus. So chapter 2, we get introduced to more ministers. We get introduced to Loken, who is the new Minister of Espionage. And he's introduced as the new Minister of Espionage. And that's part of the reason why I think that Cerberus might have been the Minister of Espionage. Obviously, Cerberus is no longer the Minister of Espionage. And then there's also Grease, who's the Minister of Dispatch. I'm not sure exactly what that means, because it kind of sounds like the Minister of Execution, Dispatch, but I'm not sure exactly it could be something more, encompassing more things than just merely executions. And then there's also Valpurgis, I think it's Valpurgis, who is the Minister of Religion. The other key element that gets introduced in this chapter is Eucharist. Now, Eucharist in the world of Empire is this super drug that Golgoth feeds to his ministers, and it gives them superpowers. I mean, it basically augments their natural abilities. They heal much faster. Their reflexes are much faster. They're much stronger. I don't think they really go into detail about exactly what it does, but that's basically what it does. And you find out in this chapter that it is made from the blood of Endymion, Endymion, I believe that's how it's pronounced, whom the world believes to be dead, that he was killed by Golgoth. That's what it's believed. But he's actually kept alive and imprisoned in a secret sub-basement in Golgoth's headquarters. I can't remember if they ever specify where his headquarters are. But the secret of Eucharist, which is that it's made from this guy's blood, is revealed both to the reader and to Xana, the minister of execution, when she gets curious and goes looking for answers. In fact, she asks a couple of the other ministers first, where Eucharist comes from. I think it's apparent that she likes the stuff. She wants more of the stuff. She wants to know more about it. She goes looking. She breaks into the sub-basement and finds Endymion, and he's basically so weak that he can't move, but he's hooked up to this machine that is basically, it keeps him alive, but at the same time keeps him weak enough that he can't do anything, but it's taking his blood, and I guess I'm not sure the exact process of creating Eucharist is. Maybe it's not created right there, but it's also kind of hinted that Valpurgis has something to do with the creation of Eucharist, but I don't think they really go any further than this in explaining where Eucharist comes from in this series. So a little bit more of background. These 2 chapters were originally published through Image Comics and later republished by DC Comics as issue 0. And then DC Comics printed 6 more issues, 6 more chapters, and all that stuff is what makes up the first volume of Empire, and all those came out in the early 2000s, and basically there was nothing else put out for about a decade until Mark Waid started Thrillbent Comics, which is this online store, which is where I have the original issues. Well, I don't have the original issues that the first 2 chapters appeared in, but I have issues 0 and issues 1 through 6, which are basically the 8 chapters that in which I read Empire back in like 2003, 2004 the first time. But I recently signed up for a subscription for Thrillbent, in large part because I wanted to read this. I was also curious about some of the other comics there, but I haven't tried any of those yet. So far, just this. And so that's where you can get them now. And I believe DC also did a trade paperback back 10, 12 years ago of Empire. You might be able to find that. I doubt that it's still in print, though. But on the whole, this is a very dark series. It's very violent. It's very bloody. Golgoth is I think it was kind of Dr. Doom or Darth Vader looking villain, although his armor kind of looks more color-wise, it looks more like Iron Man's, gold and red, although there's some other colors in there. He can teleport. You never see him remove his armor. He can teleport. He has super strength. He can shoot beams from his eyes and hands. And he rules based on fear. And in the beginning, he seems very inhuman, and then bit by bit, you see him he seems more human. And most of that comes from his relationship with his daughter. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to point out was that his eyes are the only things that you can see. They do have those visible, unlike a lot of suits of armor where you don't see the eyes. You can see his eyes, and those are the only things that you can see. Chapter 3 opens with a new character, Ambassador Rasmussen of Greenland. He's the ambassador from Greenland to the Empire. and he's getting ready to travel to Golgoth's headquarters for negotiations. There were some members of the delegation from Greenland in the first chapter of Empire, some of whom were killed when Sybaris mistakenly thought that they were there to assassinate Golgoth. There's a number of interesting meetups or encounters that happen in this chapter. The first one is Zana and Khafra. Zana, of course, the Minister of Execution, and Khafra, the Minister of Information. So she now knows, as was revealed in Chapter 2, she now knows about Eucharist. She knows where it comes from. And Khafra starts questioning her. He suspects that she knows about it, but he doesn't know about it. But he's kind of pushing her to reveal stuff, and she doesn't want to. The other two people that you see meet up, and these are two that was kind of surprising at first, but then this kind of becomes an important part of the story, is Delphi, Golgoth's daughter, and Loken, the Minister of Espionage. And you see them in bed together. And so there goes the image of Delphi as being this pure and innocent girl. So she isn't quite so innocent, but she gives him this gift, this watch, this pocket watch. And that also will play a role in this story. Getting back to Xanash, you see the secret of Eucharist becomes too much for her. She needs to tell somebody about it. It's weighing on her mind. And I suppose Khafra's interrogation didn't help either. And I don't know if interrogation is exactly the right word, his questioning. I mean, there may have been some persuasion implied, but he certainly wasn't putting her to torturing her or anything. So she needs to tell somebody about it, but she can't. So what she does is she writes it down. Only she forgets that Khafra, you see, Khafra is the Minister of Information, and he is awake all the time, probably thanks to Eucharist. And he is just constantly scanning networks, scanning things, looking for things, looking through cameras at things. His body is in this huge metal, it's like a set of armor, except for he can't move. He's locked in. It's like a metal chair that he's locked into, but it gives him all sorts of information. I guess it pumps him with whatever he needs to eat and takes care of waste material and all that. But he's got access to all these cameras everywhere. And so Xana can't keep this secret, and so she has to do something. So she writes it down, what she discovered, not realizing that Khafra's cameras are everywhere, and that he's able to see what she wrote, and is able, on camera, is able to see what she wrote and is able to take a picture of it. Now, getting back to Ambassador Rasmussen, he has traveled to Golgoth's headquarters, and it becomes apparent to Golgoth and his ministers that Greenland is hiding something. There's something that they've hidden from the Empire, something that the Empire can't seem to figure out what it is. And Golgoth, and the Empire want to find out what this is. And so in the middle of the meeting, Golgoth is talking to Rasmussen. He's telling him, well, why don't you call your wife? I understand that you like to communicate. You like to work things out with your wife, that she's an important part. Talking with her is an important part of your life. And he at first he kind of doesn't want to, and then he agrees to. And as he's talking to her on the phone, Golgoth, using a satellite-based weapon, kills Rasmussen's wife and children while he's on the phone with them. And, which just drives Rasmussen crazy, but not completely nuts. But, I mean, he's in tears. He's really broken up by this. And, I mean, which is just another example of how dark and how how dark and violent and bloody it isn't so much bloody in this case, but certainly dark and violent this series can be. And then finally, at the end of this chapter 3, which is called, by the way, starting at this point, there are names for these chapters, is called As Ye Sow. And so at the end of this chapter, there's a scene with Golgoth where he goes to Delphi and asks her about the watch, because apparently it's a family object. It's something I think that he got from his father. And there's a scene earlier in the chapter where Golgoth spots Loken with the watch. And he doesn't say anything. He just kind of looks at him, and you can see that the wheels turning in his head, and then later, so then at the end of this chapter, he asks Delphi, what happened to the watch? And so, what you've got to wonder is he astute enough to have put all the pieces together, or is he still just questioning and trying to probing? So going on to chapter 4. Chapter 4 is called Show of Force. And it begins in Egypt, or I guess what was once Egypt, right along the river Nile, where the empire is building a bridge across the Nile. The Aswan Dam had been blown up by this point. So, and in Cairo is one of the last holdouts of many of the armies of the world. The remnants of the armies of the world have gone there. And instead of launching an aerial attack, they are building a bridge across the Nile while all these other members of all these armies are waiting for them or watching them, waiting for their attack. And you get this interesting scene between Grease, the minister of dispatch, and the guy who's in charge, the officer who's in charge of building this bridge. His name is McOrley. And he's asking her, basically what I just said, why don't they just wipe them out from above? They've got the air power to wipe these people out. And Grease says, no, it's not that simple. But Grease is a woman. Grease tasks him to figure out why they're building the bridge. And this kind of floats through the rest of this chapter. Now, scene shifts and you see Loken planting a bomb in the Holy Court. We've already seen Loken betraying Golgoth by sleeping with his daughter, betraying him in some way. His trust, if nothing else. And you see him planting a bomb in the Holy Court, which is where Eucharist is distributed. Now, Loken hears it before it goes off. He plants it when nobody's in there. Then when they're all in there receiving Eucharist, he says something's going on, and I think it makes a noise or something like that. It goes off. He takes the brunt of the blast, makes a heroic gesture. He survives thanks to the Eucharist, and then he gets more of it from Golgoth, and he gives some of that Eucharist to Delphi. Now, scene shifts again. We get back to Zana and Khafra, another confrontation between them in which he hints that he knows what she wrote. He knows that she wrote something, and that he hints that he knows something, and he keeps pushing her, and so it's got to be eating inside her head that he knows what she wrote, because he makes specific reference to the cameras and writing things down. And then finally, we get this scene where Ambassador Rasmussen reveals to the leaders of Greenland that they have a new ally, and this ally is Minister Lukulin, Golgoth's Minister of War, who's offering them all sorts of weapons, that he's coming over to their side. And that's where chapter 4 ends. Now, before I wrap up here, I wanted to talk a little bit more about a couple things. One is that the terror and dread that pervades this story, and how it's depicted through Barry Kitson and James Pascoe's art in various scenes, and just in these last two chapters. You could see it in chapters 1 and 2, but it seems like there's people getting killed left and right. You see Tumbril playing with the decapitated heads of people, shooting baskets with people's heads and things like that. Like I said, this is a pretty bloody book. It's definitely I would say mature audiences. But one of the scenes in chapter 3 is that I already mentioned was when Ambassador Rasmussen's family gets killed, his wife and his 2 kids who were at home. And the way that it's played out on the page is you see Rasmussen isn't facing the screens, but you can see the screens behind him. And on the one hand, you see him calling his wife and then talking to his wife. And at the same time, you see the satellite targeting in on his family, on his home. And you see it going in, zooming in closer and closer, and then you see this blast come down, and you see his son's face in shock, and then the whole screen goes blank. And you see him flip out, turning around and flipping out, and it's just, whoa. I mean, in many ways, this kind of stuff, it's like watching a train wreck. You know, it's so horrible, but you just can't take your eyes off it. At least that's the way I feel about it. And then in chapter 4, you see, well, there's 2 things. First, you see Grease toying with Lieutenant McOrley, and you see the terror in his eyes. And there's one point Golgoth shows up at the Nile River, and McOrley doesn't realize that Golgoth is just teleported in behind him, and he says something, and Golgoth responds, and you can just see the sheer terror in him, the feeling like his life is meaningless and that he doesn't have any hope. You know, you just see his head hanging in resignation. And he doesn't die at that point. In fact, you don't see him die, although it's kind of implied that he does get killed. But I don't think you see him die at that point. Well, you definitely don't see him die at that point. And the other is the look on Xana's face when she's confronted by Khafra. And she seems confident until he says something about her having written something down in her chambers. You know, I mean, she thought that she was safe there, that his cameras couldn't reach there. Maybe it just didn't occur to her because she was burning up with this secret inside her, the secret of Eucharist. But the look on her face when she's confronted by Khafra is, you know, just once again, the terror, you know, that this is a world where anything can happen. Nobody's life is sacred, and anybody can die. Chapter 5 is titled This Time. The centerpiece of this chapter, and by centerpiece, what I mean is that this is the story that kind of runs through this whole chapter, although there's some other scenes that involve some other things, is Golgoth and Endymion. But there are 3 other interludes I'm calling them interludes. They don't title them as interludes, but there are 3 other scenes that are important that lead to things in future chapters. So I'm going to talk about those first. Actually, first I want to say This Time, the title This Time, is a reference to something that happens very, very early in the chapter. And that is, we see Endymion dreaming. And he dreams only to awake to discover that he's still a prisoner. But he's dreaming about how he wants things to turn out, about how he wants to defeat Golgoth. So that's what the title refers to this time. So I'm going to come back to that when I finish talking about this chapter. So the first of the interludes is a scene with Loken and Tumbril. And basically it's the 2 of them hanging out, talking about things. It doesn't last very long. It only lasts a couple pages. But the upshot of it, or the important thing to take from it, is that Tumbril warns Loken about mentioning Aloria. Aloria is Golgoth's dead wife, his wife, who committed suicide, and that's a piece of information that Tumbril gives to Loken that apparently Loken didn't know. So that's the first interlude. The second interlude involves Xana and Khafra. So Khafra knows that Xana knows something about Endymion. And at this point, in this scene, what we get is Xana telling Khafra what she's learned about Endymion and Eucharist. And she reveals that she has a reason for doing this. And I don't mean her thoughts. I mean, she tells Khafra she has a reason for this, and that she has a plan, that ideas of overthrowing Golgoth. So that's the second interlude. Then the third interlude takes place in Greenland, and it involves Ambassador Rasmussen and Lucullan. And Lucullan gives the Greenlandic forces, the Greenlandic troops, a rousing speech after equipping them with the new best weapons that the Empire has. And Rasmussen is impressed with this and decides to trust Lucullan. And so, as a demonstration of his trust, he introduces him to somebody who is off panel. In other words, somebody that we don't see. And he names this person Charon, Qaron. But we don't see them, and that's the end of the scene. So then getting back to what I consider to be the centerpiece of this chapter, Golgoth and Endymion, because most of the chapter seems to focus on them. Endymion is still a prisoner. As I mentioned before, the first scene we see with him, he is dreaming about defeating Golgoth, killing Golgoth, and then he wakes up and he's still a prisoner. He's got these wires going in. I don't think they're wires, actually. I think they're tubes going into him that are pumping his blood out. I mean, he's got one stuck in his forehead, like one in his neck, one in his cheek, other places on his body, like his torso. But let me see. I'm flipping back through this to see if there's... Yeah, his neck, his chest... Because the Eucharist is made from the blood, from his blood. And also by doing this, of course, Golgoth is able to keep Endymion too weak to escape. And the impression I get from this is that, from what I've read, from reading this, the first volume, is that Endymion is kind of like supposed to be the analog of Superman in this world. And I guess that would make Golgoth the analog of Lex Luthor, I think, although it probably isn't a one-for-one analog. Anyway, Golgoth visits Endymion and talks to him. He tells him about his concerns about Greenland. He's hoping to get some sort of insight, I guess, from Endymion, or maybe he just needs somebody to talk to about this. And nobody else, as far as he knows about Endymion. And he worries about what the people of Greenland might be hiding. So you get a little bit of that, and then as Golgoth's getting ready to go, Endymion whispers something. And he says, "Your wife." And what he ends up telling Golgoth, this is enough, just saying your wife is enough to get Golgoth to stop and to hang out for a bit. And what Endymion tells Golgoth is that he believes that Golgoth's wife, Aloria, was murdered, that she didn't commit suicide, that she was murdered, and that it must have been somebody close to Golgoth who did it. And then Endymion offers to find out who murdered Aloria if Golgoth will free him. Now, of course, that doesn't go anywhere, because Golgoth expresses doubt at Endymion's sincerity. He basically says, at this point, you'd say anything to get out of here. And so he leaves him. And then the final scene, the final page or two in this chapter is Endymion returning to his dreaming. And basically, that's where the title comes from. This time, I'm going to win. This time. And it's his dreams. So that's chapter 5. Chapter 6 is entitled Ember. Now, this one I felt was structured a little differently. So I'm going to talk about Xana. There are 3 scenes with Xana in this story. The first one, she's meeting with Khafra to discuss things. She has told Caphra about Eucharist and about Endymion, and she suggested that she has a plan to overthrow Golgoth. But Caphra wants more than just a working relationship. And he's obviously physically attracted to Xana. I definitely get the impression that she's not interested, and so anyway, that's the end of the first scene. The second scene is Xana and Grease. Xana, early in the scene, Xana snaps at Grease, and then she admits that Caphra is getting on her nerves. And that's basically what happens, and it's a short scene. I think it's just a page long. And then finally, in the third scene that involves Xana, we see Xana and Grease in bed together after sex, after torturing for fun a prisoner. This is how they get off. And Grease offers. Xana is still obviously bothered by Caphra, and Grease offers to fix Caphra. But by the time she offers that, Xana has dozed off, has fallen asleep. And then in the background, you can see Xana, as Xana is sleeping, you can see Grease slinking away. So the next part of this chapter I want to talk about is what I call the fall of Loken. Now, previously we've seen that Loken has started an affair with Golgoth's daughter, Delphi, which is not a good idea, no matter how you look at it. Not a good idea. And we'd also seen, anyway, let me get into this. So once again, we also get three scenes involving Loken in this chapter. In the first scene, it involves Loken and Tumbril, just like in the previous chapter, but in this case, it takes place in Loken's apartment, which he's turned upside down because he's looking for something, or something that he's lost. So the second scene involves Loken and Delphi. And they're in Delphi's apartment, or maybe living quarters would be a better way to put it. And they're in bed together. And they're in the midst of having sex, he admits to her that he's misplaced the watch that she gave him. Now, this is the watch that she got from her father, and that her father already saw Loken with. And she doesn't react well to this confession that he's misplaced the watch. And she kind of freaks out. And he tries to calm her by telling her that he has plans to go visit Caphra for help finding the watch. And then the third scene is Loken going to visit Caphra and finding out that Caphra has been murdered. And just as he happens upon Caphra's body, Grease shows up with a squad of armed men. She accuses Loken of killing Caphra, and she tries to arrest him, but he resists. He, of course, being one of the inner circle, being the minister of espionage, or just being one of Golgoth's ministers, has taken Eucharist, and so he's, very hard to catch. But we don't see a resolution to that. That's kind of the end of this. So maybe it's a little early to be calling this the fall of Loken, but this is definitely the beginning of him falling out of favor. Then we get a very short scene. Actually, this scene takes place very early in the chapter. It takes place in Greenland, and it's kind of a framing sequence. It involves, once again, Lucullan and Rasmussen. And Lucullan tells a story, and this kind of frames the rest of what I'm going to talk about in this chapter, which is a story about what he says, or what he calls the story of when Golgoth experienced a crisis of faith. So the final part of this chapter that I'm going to talk about is really about Golgoth and Aloria, this couple, whom in the present Aloria is dead. The first story we've gotten is that she committed suicide. Endymion insists that she was murdered, although Endymion is desperate to escape, so maybe he's just making that up. So we get three scenes about Golgoth and Aloria. The first two take place in flashback. It's not clear exactly when it takes place, but it's definitely a flashback. And there's at least a couple things that point to that. Some of the hairstyles are different. For instance, Lucullen's hair, which in the present is white, is dark, is brown, and the style is somewhat different. You also see Siberius showing up in the flashbacks, and he's dead in the present at this point. So the first scene basically revolves around an argument between Golgoth and Eloria. And she's tired of him always being away because he's, trying to conquer territory. He's trying to solidify his hold on the whole world. I mean, he doesn't have a hold on the whole world. There are still countries that are holding out, and I think at this point even the United States is still intact. But so that's what this first scene is. The second scene involves Golgoth and Lucullen. And in this scene, Lucullen confronts Golgoth in front of a crowd of advisors or ministers, and he kind of gets backed into doing this. He's talking about it to some other ministers when Golgoth walks in, and all of a sudden somebody's like, well, why don't you tell him now? Or maybe it's Golgoth who says that, why don't you tell me now? And Lucullen insists that Golgoth is getting soft and that his devotion to his family is costing the empire. So that's the second scene. So both those scenes take place in the past. You can tell it's the past, like I said, based on the fact that the hair color, based on the fact that Siberius is still there, and also based on the fact that Delphi looks much younger. Like she's certainly under 10, probably 6 or 7, I'd guess, something like that. So the third scene is now back in the present, and we see Golgoth reflecting on what Endymion told him in the previous chapter. Specifically, the allegation that Eloria was murdered. And that's kind of the end of this chapter. So that's the end of chapter 6. Now, in describing these last 2 chapters, I've unpacked and rearranged the scenes quite a bit. Instead of taking everything, trying to describe everything in order, I took it, I tried to organize it in a way that makes sense. But I really do love the way that these different stories in these chapters are layered together. So you get a couple pages of this storyline, a couple pages of that storyline, and it's just beautifully done. And the artwork is great, the visual storytelling, and I'm really enjoying this. Chapter 7 is called Good Intentions. And as I prepared my notes for this, as I skimmed through this chapter, it really gives me the chills. And I mean, there's things about the story as a whole, but I think a lot of them come to a head in this chapter. So the bulk of this chapter revolves around Delphi. And there's basically 3 scenes as I see it. Although one kind of blends into another, but this is how I think of it. The first scene is Loken is on the run from Greece and her troops. And he turns to Delphi for help, so he shows up at her quarters. And Loken tells Delphi about what happened when he went to talk to Caphra, about Caphra being dead and being accused of killing Caphra. And he explains, that he's now a wanted man, and she doesn't take it well. She kind of flips out. That's a few pages. Then the next scene, which is all in the same location, is the door opens to her living quarters, and in walks Golgoth. And Loken gets really nervous and tries to explain he tries to explain what he's doing there, and he tries to explain about Caphra, and because there's no reason for him to be in Delphi's quarters. He shouldn't be there. And Golgoth's nonverbal response is to hold out his arm and open his hand and show them that he has the watch that Loken misplaced. And at that point, Delphi jumps in and she tries to explain that she did it all for him, for Golgoth, for her father, including something that she did long ago, and that is killing her mother. She's the one who murdered her mother, who murdered Aloria. And Golgoth seems to remain calm until he realizes that Loken may have given Delphi Eucharist. And at that point, he starts to strangle Loken. He demands to know if Delphi has had Eucharist, and Delphi implores him not to kill Loken. And so she talks him down. She talks her father down from doing this, from killing Loken, and he agrees, provided Loken can evade capture and never returns. And so Loken starts to leave, but before he does, Delphi tells him, wait, there's just one more thing. And, she's talking about how she loves him, and she says, but there's just one more thing, and then she screams at the top of her lungs, which brings the guards running, and Loken takes off, And all this is, oh God, it's so good. It's so well done. It's really suspenseful, and it's really chilling in ways. I mean, the whole revelation that she's the one who killed her mother, and just the tension of what's going to happen when Golgoth walks in and finds Loken in her chambers. So the final scene is Loken's gone at this point, and Delphi and Golgoth are alone in her room, and Golgoth he's clearly shaken. And Delphi tries to reassure him. She sits on his lap, and with tears in her eyes, she begs him not to hate her. And at that point, Golgoth reassures her. He hugs her, and then he snaps her neck. And oh my God, that scene just, finding out that she'd killed her mother, and then seeing him kill his daughter, oh my God. Wow. Okay, so there's one more thing that happens in this chapter. It doesn't have to do directly with Golgoth and Delphi, and this takes place in Greenland. And once again, we're seeing Lucullan and Rasmussen, and they're meeting with the secret allies of Greenland, the Charon, who were revealed to be aliens, and we finally see them in panel. So they meet, and then Lucullan walks off, and after Lucullan leaves, as the invasion of Greenland is beginning, the Charon admit to Rasmussen that they've made a mistake. Or no, they say that a mistake has been made, and they don't wish to be allies, or they don't think they can work with Greenland anymore. And then they vanish, leaving Rasmussen wondering what made them change their minds. And that's the way chapter 7 ends. This is just a great chapter. And so before I move on to talking about chapter 8, I want to talk about some of the great panels in this chapter. The first panel, and this really goes across a couple pages. It's more than just one panel. But the first panel is when, after Loken has told Delphi what's happened about Grease chasing after him and him being a wanted man, she flips out. And she slaps him, she curses at him, and then there's this scene of her standing over him, and him cowering. It's just this reversal of roles. Not that he had been violent towards her, but it's just this, I guess, reversal of Delphi, and it's the way it's depicted, and the look on her face, the look in her eyes. It's just, wow. Really, really something. The next scene or the next panel that really impresses me, and there's really a couple panels here as well, is when after Golgoth, well, first off, just seeing Golgoth walk in is one thing, and then him holding up this watch, and it's a pocket watch, and so he's holding it by the chain, and it's like, oh my God, this is where it is, and maybe it's not that hard to guess that he's the one who had it, and that's why Loken couldn't find it. But still, just the way it's drawn, and it's just the simplicity of it. And first, there's a panel with him just holding it out, and all you can see is his hand and the watch. And then on the next page, there's another panel with him on one side and Loken and Delphi on the other, with him with his arm stretched out with the watch. And the only words in that panel are Delphi saying, "Daddy, Daddy." And then there's a flashback in this scene where you see Delphi holding the knife with which she killed her mother, Aloria. And I mean, that's just really chilling, seeing a daughter, a young girl, and she's young at this point. This is not something that she did just a couple years before, when she was in her mid to late teens, and she is still a teenager. But I mean, this is something that she did probably 10 years before, when she was like 8 or 9 or 10. So, I mean, that's definitely chilling. And then there's the look in, and it's not just this scene, but there's the look, or this panel, there's the look in Golgoth's eyes after Loken has left. You can see the bugged out look in his eyes. You can see the reflection of Delphi's face on his helmet. And it's, it's, what have I done? What have I created? Who is this? And then finally, there's the coloring. I mean, it's not just the panel. I mean, it was shocking to see him snap his daughter's neck, but the way they do it, the coloring, it's all in this red wash over the panels where he snaps her neck, and I found that to be very effective. So moving on. Chapter 8 is called it's called Consummate Plan. And this chapter basically breaks down into two parts. The first part is about the fall of Greenland, or that's what I would call it. And that breaks into two parts. The first part of the fall of Greenland is that at first things seem to be going well for the fighting forces of Greenland, but with using these weapons that were supplied by Lucullan. But then all of a sudden the weapons stop functioning. And it becomes very apparent that they've been betrayed by Lucullan. Apparently it was all a ruse, him switching sides. And then Golgoth shows up to lead the final bloody assault. And no prisoners are taken, and Greenland falls. So that's the first part of the fall of Greenland. The other thing that's happening kind of at the same time is that Rasmussen communicates with the Charon one last time, and they've returned for two reasons. The first is to reveal to him why they abandoned Greenland, and it's because they felt that the leaders of Greenland, the people of Greenland, were too ready to use violence to defend themselves. And I was a little confused by this because I'm not sure what they really expected. There is some mention of the Charon wanting no, it's not. I keep thinking the word world mind, but that's not what it is. But they want some sort of peace and harmony, I think. But I'm not sure what they expected the people of Greenland to do. Maybe they were offering to defend Greenland, from the Empire. If the people of Greenland, wouldn't fight for themselves, I don't know. But the other thing that they've come back for is because Rasmussen knows too much, they tell him he has to die and they kill him. Because they're afraid that the information he has about them, about the Charon, will fall into the hands of Golgoth. That he'll get tortured by Golgoth's forces, by Tumbril presumably, and Golgoth will then have information about them, although it's unclear to the reader what that information would be exactly, other than the fact that they exist, because after all, Lucullan knows of their existence, but I guess he doesn't know a whole lot beyond that. So that's the end of the fall of Greenland. Then what you get, the second half of this chapter is basically setting things up. There's basically 4 scenes that set things up for what follows, what comes next. The first of those scenes is brief. You see Loken on the run. So he's still alive. He managed to escape Golgoth's headquarters, and he's out on the street somewhere, still alive, and on the run. And so presumably that will get picked up on. The second scene you see is Grease and Zana. And in this, Grease basically hints that she's the one who killed Khafra. Which was kind of apparent from some of the things that I don't think I mentioned, but was kind of apparent from the previous, well, not the previous chapter, but chapter 6, when Loken was accused of being Khafra's killer. Now the third scene is we meet Des. Des was one of Khafra's assistants and is now Khafra's replacement. And she may have been in a scene or two before, but I don't remember if she was named before. But so she's his replacement, and she seems reluctant to take his place, to become the new Minister of Information. But it also seems as though she doesn't have much of a choice in the matter. And it's really chilling looking at that scene where she is being wired into the suit in which she's probably going to live for the rest of her life. And as she's being wired in, you see a single tear running down her cheek. I mean, because can you imagine that, being against your choice, being wired into a suit and being expected to perform a role and losing that freedom to move around? And it's chilling. It was really chilling. And then the final scene is back to Golgoth. He's sitting in Delphi's room next to her dead body, and he's remembering things. And we see a few flashback panels, and it's revealed that he knew about Loken. He knew that Delphi had been seeing Loken, and he was seemingly okay with it. But what he wasn't okay with was her following in his footsteps. And then there's a brief scene where you see somebody coming up to him and saying there's an uprising in Johannesburg, and he's like, I'm on it, let's go, and apparently Lucullan's already there. And that's the end of volume 1. So I have a few more thoughts about this. Well, one basic thought, which is that, and this relates to a couple things. And this thought is basically that Golgoth values independent thinkers. And there's a couple instances where Lucullan speaks up. There's not many people who were willing to speak their mind to Golgoth, but Lucullan does on a couple occasions, and shows fear at doing so. But Golgoth takes Lucullan's attitude, I guess you could say, because Lucullan isn't willing to just follow orders. He thinks for himself, and Golgoth values that. I think you also see that in what happened with Eloria and Delphi. Eloria is in the brief scenes that we see her in, is shown to be somebody who disagreed with what was going on, disagreed with her husband, at least to the extent that she didn't like him being away as much as he was. And Delphi killed her. And I mean, it makes me wonder, and it's not clear, but it makes me wonder if part of the reason why, well, he was obviously devoted to Eloria. He obviously loved her. He doesn't want anybody to talk about her. That's revealed, I think, back at the beginning of chapter 5 when Tumbrel and Loken are talking. But and also to a degree, also in chapter 5 from those scenes between Golgoth and Endymion. But I have to wonder if part of the reason why he killed his daughter is because she killed her mother. And her mother was somebody who was outspoken. And she is not. She is somebody who just wants to follow her father, who wants to be just like her father. And he wanted her to be her own person. And for whatever reason, she was unable to do that. So that's basically it. That's my final thought on Volume 1 of Empire. I've only just started reading Volume 2. I've read like a couple chapters, and it wasn't recently. It was several weeks ago. I did look online, and there are a couple of trades coming out of Volume 2. And it can also be read at Thrillbent, which is how I'm reading it. You get a subscription for like $4 a month or something like that, and you can read as much as you want for that month. Volume 1 is out of print. I think you can still find it online, but you might have to pay. I think I've found copies for like $10, $12, but I've also seen copies going for like $50. So I don't know if DC Comics or Thrillbent, and they're printing Volume 2 through IDW, and I think it's a couple collections at least so far. But Volume 1 you can get through Thrillbent.com, and actually if you pay for a 1-month membership, you can download the PDF, which is what I have on my tablet. I have a PDF of Volume 1. I also have the issues. I read it when it first came out. But that's it for episode 96 of Dave Talks Comics. Dave Talks Comics can be found on the web at davetalkscomics.com and facebook.com/DaveTalksComics. On Twitter, at Dave Talks Comics. Email can be sent to davetalkscomics@gmail.com. Next time on Dave Talks Comics, I'll be talking about the second half of the first season of Knights of Sidonia. I'm Dave. Thank you for listening.